welcome to this CT Go podcast brought to you by the Counterterrorism Team here at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. The views expressed here today during our podcast are those of the speakers alone and do not represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. My name is Lumpy Lumbaca. I'm one of the faculty members here at APCSS, and today we will be discussing the insurgency in Southern Thailand. Our guest is Mr. Don Pathan. Don, it's great to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm okay, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about Don's background, which is very unique, and it makes him a rare expert on the situation in the Thai South. All right, so Don is a senior program officer for the Asia Foundation in Thailand. He joined the foundation last year after spending the past 2 decades covering diplomacy, international relations, transnational crime, and insurgency in Southeast Asia as a freelance consultant and a writer. Don briefs diplomats, international organizations, and think tanks on security matters on a regular basis. Prior to joining the foundation in Bangkok last year, he was living in Yala, one of the 3 southernmost provinces hit by a 17-year insurgency. And so far has claimed more than 7,000 lives since January 2004. Don has co-authored Confronting Ghost, Thailand's Shapeless Southern Insurgency with Dr. Joseph Leo, and wrote a chapter in The Trouble in the Triangle, Opium and Conflict in Burma, in which he examined the nexus between the United Wa State Army, the Thai government, and the military regime of Burma. He also co-authored Borders of On the Mind, Borders in the Jungle, Islamic Insurgency and Ethno-Religious Irredentism in Southern Thailand, with Professor David Camro, and Promoting Conflict or Peace Through Identity. All right, Don, before we get into the situation that's going on in the South today, could you give us a general idea of what's been transpiring in the South and Southern Thailand over the last 17 or so years? I know it's a lot of time to cover, but just some general thoughts, trends, if you have anything you can share with us.
I'll be brief. It didn't start 17 years ago. It started back in the early 60s, and it went under in the late 80s, early 90s. That was the first wave. The second wave started around 2001, mid 2001, and it was during the government of Thaksin Shinawatra. And he, of course, didn't really acknowledge it. He called him a sparrow bandit. Not until the January 4, 2004, when scores of insurgents raided an army battalion and made off with almost 400 pieces of military weapons. At that point, the Thai government could no longer deny the political underpinning of the act. So all of a sudden, yes, we have a new generation of Pathan Malay separatist insurgent on our hand. The question was to do about it. So the Thai government did what they know, which is what they used to when they fought the previous wave from the 60s up until late 80s, early 90s. And also at the time, at that period, you also had the communists too, the communist insurgency. So what did they do? They employed the same tactics, close the border, put various districts under curfew, dispatch a large amount of a number of troops down there, and came up with their counterinsurgency was basically 2-pronged: one military and one development. Aim at winning hearts and minds, throwing money into that. But it never really worked. Because it's not really about development. It's about state-minority relation. The Pathan Malay. Keep in mind that the border was drawn at the at the turn of the century, 1909. But armed insurgency did not surface until 60s. So what happened 50 years? Long story short, it was a reaction against the Thai policy of assimilation. And for the Malay, it came at the expense of their religious identity. For them, that's a no-no. We could carry your ID card, but you just can't change our way of life, force us to adopt another identity. That was their reaction. Thus, the armed insurgency, 2006, there was a coup. Prime Minister Surya Juranon tried hard to lay down a foundation. He issued an executive order to use non-military means. Now, Surya was a former army chief.
Right.
Got help from abroad, international community. But he also said that he's not going to stay long. You know, he was there for only a year. Then he stepped down and turned the mandate back to the civilian. He did other good things, and he received a lot of praises. But the foundation that he laid down was short-lived, mainly because of the Thai political situation was so unstable. 2013, you have Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra, sister of Thaksin. For the first time, she announced publicly, went to Malaysia, asked Malaysia to be the facilitator, mediator for this process. Everybody was caught off guard, including the BRN, Barisan Revolusi Nasional, the one group that controlled virtually all of the combatants on the ground, and the Thai army, the biggest stakeholder, one of the, the biggest political entity in Thailand, they were caught off guard. So it was a political initiative by Yingluck and the then Prime Minister Najib Razak. They did the right thing, but for wrong reason, meaning that they was trying to cash in politically on this. So the army was caught off guard, the rebels caught off guard, but the rebels sent people there anyway, just some small potatoes. And the idea was to derail it, and which they did. Derailed it within a few months later, derailed the peace initiative, because they were caught off guard. Nobody was ready to talk, And so, and then again, another coup, May 2014. This time around, the army, who was not part of that Yingluck initiative, peace initiative, thought about it for 7 months. What do we do? Should we continue with something that Yingluck started, or do we ditch the whole thing? But if we did, we look bad, right, in the eyes of the international community.
Sure. Yep.
7 months later, they went to Malaysia again and asked Malaysia to be the facilitator. But this time around, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, who has been re-elected, he was the coup leader at the time, and he said, well, let's start this, ask Malaysia to be a facilitator, and but on one condition: it has to be inclusive, meaning all these long-standing groups come together and form some sort of umbrella and then talk to the Thai. His attitude, like most Thai top brass, was like, get this done, get it over with, But for the BRN, it said, hey, I'm the one who control all the combatant on the ground, So I'm not going to join this forum. So for a long time, like 3 or 4 years, it went on like this, Thai negotiator talking to a group, an umbrella group called Mara Patani, who had no control of the combatant on the ground, So anyway, fast forward to January this year, all of a sudden, the elders, we call them the elders, or the ruling council of the BRN, gave their political people, I don't want to use the word political wing, it's just too much credit. These are more like motley crew, of guys who try to play, who trying to become something like a Sinn Féin,
Sure.
Suppose Sinn Féin IRA in that context.
Yep.
But they're still light years from that. But anyway, they were permitted to go meet the Thai quietly, secretly. And the thing is, without Malaysia knowing, they got some foreign mediators to put the meeting together. They had 3 or 4 meetings, I think. The last one was in Berlin, and then Malaysia found out. Oh man, they were really upset, So anyway, that was in November, mid-November, the so-called Berlin Initiative. But after that, when Malaysia threw a hissy fit, Thailand decided to, well, let's make it public. Ask the BRN political wing to, this past January, to announce publicly. I had a press conference. I had a brief meeting and a press conference to announce that, we got the real BRN now at the table, talking to the Thai. And thank you, Malaysia, this and that. I always see Malaysia as a stakeholder, not an honest broker,
Right.
They have to be there to resolve their complexities, we share the common border. I mean, theoretically, as a mediator, you want to get somebody as far away as possible, right? According to textbooks. But
Right.
Malaysia, they same common border, and a lot of, and the border is very porous. People go back and forth, and this and that. So that's where we at right now. This talk. That, and then COVID-19 came and it kind of stalled everything, But keep in mind that the powerful military wing of the of the BRN are not happy with this, but they went along with the elders and said, okay, let these so-called negotiators go, but keep him on a very short leash. And, that's where we're at right now.
Right. Yeah. Speaking to the peace process, going back a little bit, as you said, that's been going on for almost 2 decades now, right?
Right.
With various results here and there. Question I've always had on that, how genuine are both sides walking into the peace process? As mainly, I'm getting to, as far as giving something up, making some concessions. Do you think both sides? And it's hard to say both sides, right? Because the government side, the Thai government side, is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is a very big mixed match of organizations. BRN is just one, as you mentioned. But do you think either of these two sides are willing to make some genuine concessions to find peace in the South?
Well, it's hard to, I think if they started think critically back in 2004
Right.
about that, see this as a state minority relation and what kind of concession we have to make. I always tell the Thai to expand the narrative. Your narrative is basically focused on the Siamese Thai.
Mhm.
Their heroes have to be your heroes. I always use America. As American living here, I always use the state minority relation. I use the Native American as an example.
Right.
How like almost a third or quarter of the cities in America named after Native Americans.
Right.
Seattle, Washington, that's a good example. And this
Yeah.
kind of stories appeal to them.
Right.
Yes, we have problem on the street right now and this and that. But, if you look at the whole big pictures, there was a lot of initiative where in the US you expand that narrative. And I think that's what has to happen here. And that never happened. That's one. And two, um, there's no continuity. And because there's no continuity, the government kept changing coup after coup. We had
Right.
2 coups in the past 10 years and street protests, all that. There's no time to really think about this or to carry out. Because every new government when they come in, they dissolve the previous negotiating team and put in their own people. And so
Right.
they have to start back again. So there's no continuity. And the BN is sitting back and said, well, they're not willing to make any concession. So why should we come to the table? And more importantly, the BN are not ready. They don't really understand. They're not like Sinn Féin, where Jerry Adams could fly all over the world and give press conference and this and that.
Right.
They're not recognized as a genuine political wing. There is no such thing. For the Thai, all of you are criminals. So it's hard to come up to surface publicly when the Thai state still treats all of you, these guys, whether political or not, as criminals. The fact that you
Right.
challenge our narrative, our state constructed narrative, this is a no-no. So
Right.
the continuity, the lack of it is one, or political instability is really the reason why there's no continuity. Without really serious discussion, I don't think we never had the time. Thailand never had the time to talk about what is willing to give up, put it that way, what kind of concession we have to make. For the BRN side now, they're using words like, I know this is not an Islamist struggle. The banner is still very much a Patani,
Right.
which is the Malay civilization, Malay historical homeland. It's an ethno-nationalist struggle.
Right.
But more and more people are using a religious connotation, word like wajib. It's not
Right.
quite jihad, but it's a moral obligation. These guys are telling that, when they do recruitment, they would talk about history. They would talk about narrative, how the Thai Siamese come over and destroying your identity, your narrative, and this. Hardly ever about Islam. But this has been 17 years. And what I notice is more and more people are using Islamic terminologies, like,
Mm.
we have a moral obligation to liberate this homeland. Notice the religious connotation. So that's becoming a big concern for a lot of people. Why?
Mm.
Because once it becomes a religious thing, then it's hard to compromise, right? So
Yeah.
to make deal with the nationalists,
Sure.
but for if the banner, if the political context changed from ethno-nationalists to jihadists, it's going to be a totally different ball game. It would be an uncharted territory, the kind of territory that Thailand have never seen before.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point, right? Because for so many years, people have speculated about whether this is a jihadist movement, but I've always seen it more as, it's about, like you said, culture, identity, how we educate our own people in the South, independence in some regards, right?
Right,
And now it seems to be shifting, and that leads me to one point that's come up for as long as I've been looking at the South, which is people wonder whether jihadists, whether it's regional ones like JI who've tried to get their foot in down the South, or maybe some larger global jihadist organizations, Al Qaeda, ISIS, if you will, have a chance of getting their foot in the door. And so far, they've been unsuccessful, at least for the last 20 years. They've given it their best shot. But where do you see that? Like, why haven't they been successful in the South? And do you see that changing?
That's a good question. If you look at the past, not too long ago, really, back in the early 2000s, you had JI, Jamaat Islamiyah, had Al Qaeda knocking on their doors, but they all went back to Indonesia empty-handed.
Right.
Guys like Nicholas, Ambrosi, Hambali, all these guys behind the Bali bombings, they all came to southern Thailand. But they all went back empty-handed. The reason is because the struggle down there is very much an ethno-nationalist one. I asked a lot of the insurgents, I said, look, I'm not encouraging you to, but why haven't you embraced these kind of ideas, these outside ideas like, Al Qaeda, like Jamaat Islamiyah, and this and that. And they would laugh and said, oh, we are Shafi'i, which is one of the four schools of thought in Sunni Islam. We're not Salafi, which is Wahhabi, which would be the reformists, The thing about Shafi'i is that it permits local culture to flourish. Now, when I say local culture, I'm talking about something that is carried forward from Hindu and Buddhism, and that's been around here for thousands of years. Islam came just only a few hundred years ago, and yes, the scripture changed to the Quran, from the Buddhist text to the Quran, but the practice is very much the same. Like, for example, making the holy water, exorcism, that kind of things, These are very much Buddhist practices, but they also do it down there. The Muslim does it too, but they use the Quran, they're reading from the Quran, not from the Buddhist text. You see what I'm saying? So basically, the four school in Sunni Islam, the four school of thought, permits local culture to flourish, and that would be their explanation why you want it to be terrorists like these JI guys, we have to convert, basically. And that's a simple explanation. I guess long story short would be that the cultural barrier against outside ideas coming into southern Thailand, I think that has helped. But here's the problem for Thailand: that cultural barrier, that cultural characteristic of the Malay, which is rooted in Buddhism, they don't like to admit it, but but that's the thing that saves southern Thailand from a lot of these radical ideas. I encourage the Thai to promote this identity. Say, well, but it doesn't jive with ours, I said, well, then you have to expand your identity or definition or what Thai is or what Thai can be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting.
I hope I
yeah, no, absolutely. That's very insightful. So let's move up to today. Coronavirus has, shown us a quell in the violence, really, at levels unseen to this point in the last 20 years, for example. I think there was a month that went by without any major incidents going on. What's the status of COVID, and what has that done for peace? And can we expect this to continue?
Well, here's the thing. When the BRN political wing was permitted to surface, and one of the things they wanted to do was to bring some legitimacy and recognition to the BRN, to the movement. So they were toying with this idea on how to take the moral high ground. One of the things they did in January was to sign a deed of commitment with this NGO called INGO called Geneva Call, and basically Geneva works with non-state actors, armed non-state actors around the world on rules of engagement. Geneva Protocol, Geneva Agreement, is it what it's called? You know, the rules of war, basically.
Right. Sure. Convention.
Yeah, Geneva Convention and all that. So BNN took advantage of that by signing that deed. And from that, they got a lot of brownie points on that.
Right.
And then when Antonio Guterres, the UN section, came out with this plea to all the, conflict around the world to pause it for on humanitarian ground. They did that too, so they became, basically they got a lot of brownie points from their people and quietly from the international community,
Right.
by announcing unilateral ceasefire. But ironically, it really upset a lot of the top brass. So we said, well, we're not part of this, ceasefire. It's a unilateral thing. So we're not going to stop what we're doing. But they didn't just stop. They stepped up. They were sending people on long-range reconnaissance patrol. They got gunboat out. They got helicopter out,
Right.
chasing these guys, And then it was a tough fight. And these guys just avoiding, these guys, the BRN combatant was trying to avoid the fight as much as they can, and then the violence still continues somewhat, not much, because these guys are avoiding. And
right.
So what happened, the latest strategies was to expand their security grid, tighten the grid on the ground, just kind of waiting for these guys to cross their path, and engage them. So I guess in a way, the COVID-19 has helped bring some civility, to the area, and gave them something to go on, in terms of how to win, how to get the attention and respect of the international community, which they did.
Yeah. Speaking of the BRN, just quickly, how obviously they are the biggest, most influential, insurgent organization in the South, at least from my understanding. What about the other organizations that are down there? Are they really marginalized? And if we're just dealing with the BRN and as we are in the case with the ceasefire, is that good enough? Or do we still have worries about other organizations?
One of the worries from the Thai security apparatus is that one of these guys can make a comeback,
Right.
They could be putting things together right now. But then again, a lot of you have to think about it. It's hard to do because these guys are living in Europe. They were given exile
Right.
after the late 80s. After that first wave. And but their heart is still here. And I don't blame them. I'm not against them. And they keep it ambiguity when people ask them if you have command control on the ground, they remain ambiguous about that. But I would argue that they don't,
Okay.
I even challenges them, send me to your camps, I talked to the BRN, but I've never talked to any other groups, the
Okay.
combatant on the ground, that is, put it that way, so
Right.
but they're trying to, I think ideally these other long-standing group like PULO, BIPP, MIP can evolve into like a sort of political umbrella or political wing, while the BIN remain the combatant, But then again,
Right.
it's a hard sell, it's a hard sell,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, before we wrap this up, so my impression is that I don't think either side has fully taken advantage of this COVID situation. There seems to be a lull in activity and violence. It seems like it was a missed opportunity, because we're already talking about opening things up in the US and in Thailand as well. And I guess the fear is, and I'm curious as to what the Thai security forces in the South would think, but fear is as we open things up, we're going to go right back to business as usual. And this could have been a really big missed opportunity to find peace.
Well, yeah, behind the scenes, there's people who working to get, Thai side anyway, quietly asking the BRN, sending messages through interlocutor, yeah, can they expand this, ceasefire a little longer, even after the pandemic has ended, so they need
Right.
to breathe space. So behind the scenes, yes, there's that kind of discussions. Yes, you're right.
Okay.
I mean, BRN was the one who took advantage of the COVID-19 and they came out looking really, really good. And
Yep.
but all of this depend on the next army chief.
Yep.
In September when you get the army chief. The current army chief is not a big fan of the peace process, and that's why he
Okay.
didn't go along. He's not the fan of, he see this as an issue of law and order, that this guy has to be crushed,
Okay.
and that's what he did. That's why they stepped up the security grid, the long range response patrol, even after BRN said that we're going to end all hostilities. They did not
Mm.
reciprocate this. I mean, partly is because, well, mainly is because the Thai army never liked the idea of BRN being recognized or appreciated by the members of international community. As far as they're concerned, this is an issue of law and order and it has to be dealt with accordingly. Now, my discussion with the RTA guys, well, the Army guys, is like, well, maybe the next Army chief would think or feel differently about the peace process. Let's hope so. So until then, so we're talking about 4 or 5 months from now. So
Right.
until then, we won't really know which way it's going to go. You know what I
Right.
mean?
That's a challenge. As you mentioned, you were talking about administrations turning over often before, and we have the same issues with the Thai military, right? Every October, we're looking at turnover, so it's challenging with different leadership there as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Don, we're coming to a close here. I'll give you a couple more minutes. Is there anything, some insights that we haven't talked about here today? Anything you'd like to share with us for our audience?
Well, just I think there's a room for members of the international community, but you have to be kind of quiet and sensible about it. Thai are very nervous about, outside interference. They don't like to debate about the legitimacy of the Malay rebel groups or the fact that their narrative is not accommodating to Malay Muslim minority in the far south. So, but I think there's a lot of lesson they can learn from, about state minority relation that can learn from other countries. And I think,
Okay.
I would urge members of the international community to engage the government, but quietly though. I mean, faces are very important here in Asia. So
Right.
I think how they go about it, that's also very important too. So
Okay. All right, Don. Well, we can't thank you enough for your time here today. This was a really great discussion. I know that our alumni and all of our listeners around the world who have an interest in the situation in Southern Thailand, they're going to find this extremely insightful. Thanks again for talking with us today, Don.
thanks for having me, Lumpy.
Yeah, it's been great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings an end to this podcast. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast brought to you by our counterterrorism team here at DKI APCSS. And have a great day. Take care, everybody.